I personally have a cancer history and I was diagnosed in 2015. So, because of that, I have done a lot of research that very clearly suggests that electromagnetic fields are a very potent human carcinogen. Yet we see this forward progression, this technological march forward of cell phones and cell towers everywhere. It just seems to go on without abatement. And so I just wanted to tell this story because I feel like this is a really important story to tell about cancer and EMF. No one's really telling it. We can all learn and share.
From the Weston A. Price Foundation, welcome to the Wise Traditions podcast for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. We are your source for scientific knowledge and traditional wisdom to help you achieve optimal health.
Hey everybody, I'm your host Hilda Labrada-Gore. This is episode 206 and our guest is Brandon LaGreca. Brandon joins us today from Wisconsin, where he is a licensed acupuncturist, a nationally certified Oriental medicine practitioner, and the author of Cancer and EMF Radiation, How to Protect Yourself from the Silent Carcinogen of Electropollution. You know it as well as I do. We are surrounded on a daily basis by radiation, from the electricity wired throughout our homes, to the microwaves in our office break room, to our cell phones and many devices that we constantly are attached to. I don't know if that's good grammar, but you know what I'm talking about. Brandon has researched the root causes of cancer because he himself was diagnosed with stage 4 non-Hodgkin's lymphoma in 2015. Today, he is in remission, and he helps us wrap our heads around the threat that electromagnetic fields pose to our health. He broadens our understanding of what they are, how they impact our hormone and overall health, and he also offers simple steps we can take to protect ourselves from them. Before we get into the conversation, a quick shout out to our sponsor, Grass-Fed Kidney by Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats and bone marrow in convenient gelatin capsules. Our family loves these supplements, so order yours today at ancestralsupplements.com. And this month marks the 20th anniversary of the Weston A. Price Foundation. Help us celebrate 20 years of accurate information on diet and health by supporting local farms. Take the 50-50 pledge. Spend at least 50% of your food dollar buying directly from local farmers and artisans. With the other 50% of your food dollar, you can celebrate how small the world has become and enjoy products from other parts of the world. If you decide to join us, please tag us at Weston A. Price on your social media posts this month, or use the hashtag 5050pledge. And thanks for joining hands with us in this wonderful venture. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. Welcome to Wise Traditions, Brandon.
Hi, Hilda. Thanks for having me.
Oh, my pleasure. So I understand that you wrote this book on EMFs and cancer from a very personal vantage point. Can you tell us a little bit about that backstory?
Yeah, that's right. Well, I personally have a cancer history, and I was diagnosed with 2015 with cancer. And so because of that, I have done a lot of research. And because I'm a clinician and treat a lot of patients, I have a great interest in this area. And so when I really started looking at all the different things that we are exposed to, this greater umbrella of environmental medicine, I really honed in on the first story that I wanted to tell in my own writing. This specific story about cancer and EMF. And I think of it as really being the elephant in the room, truly, because we have this research, which we'll get a chance to talk about in a little bit, that very clearly suggests that electromagnetic fields are a very potent human carcinogen. Yet we see this forward progression, this technological march forward of cell phones and cell towers everywhere. It just seems to go on without abatement. And so I just wanted to tell this story because I feel like this is a really important story to tell. No one's really telling it in this way that we can all learn and share.
Absolutely. So Brandon, did you really put two and two together with your own cancer diagnosis? Like, were you like, oh, I got cancer right where I had my cell phone? Like, is that what happened?
No, and I have to say in retrospect, I can't say with any certainty that electromagnetic fields were the prime driver of my particular cancer. I was diagnosed with lymphoma in 2015. And what you'll see in shortly is a lot of the research seems to suggest that electromagnetic fields are more implicated in head and neck cancers, particularly brain cancer, which is known as glioma. But I will say it this way, I don't think that being exposed to electromagnetic fields did me any favors as well. And so we have to look collectively at all the different kind of carcinogens that we are exposed to. Now, looking back in my history, I knew I was exposed to certain chemicals in the area that I grew up with that were probably, for me, linked to my specific kind of cancer. But then being in this environment with this extra carcinogen, for sure. Like I say, I don't think it did me any favors. So, I think our job is to look very holistically about our bodies, about our health, and to determine, what are all the different ways we can lower our risk. Electropollution is one more risk that we do need to consider about, especially if you've been diagnosed with cancer.
Yeah, so what I want to do right now is kind of take the Google view, if you will, Google
Sure.
Maps or Google Earth, and step back and look at what is going on electromagnetically around us. Isn't the world like one big electromagnetic field?
Absolutely. And so if we go back into the history a little bit, we have some pretty interesting markers in time that kind of flesh out this story. I'll start in 1936. There was a Yale scientist named Harold Saxton Burr, who, to our knowledge, was really the first person who took a voltmeter and put it on the human body. And he realized that, lo and behold, we're electromagnetic beings. We emit an electromagnetic field. And his research became what we now know is the field of bioelectronics. It's the same field that has given us the pacemaker. Our brains and the neurological activity of our brain gives off an electromagnetic field. Our heart gives off an electromagnetic field. And a fun fact, our heart gives out an even wider electromagnetic field than our brain even does. So clearly we are electromagnetic beings. But then fast forward to 1952, there's a researcher named Winifred Schumann, and he discovered that the Earth itself almost has like a pulse to it. And it was coined the Schumann resonance, which is right around 7.8 hertz. And we'll talk about what hertz means in a little bit. But it's almost as if the Earth itself has this hum to it. And the theory of what this resonant hum is to the planet, if you look at the Earth from above, you have the ionosphere, which is way up high in the sky. And then you have the surface of the Earth where we live. And the whole thing's like a battery. We live where it's negatively charged here on the surface of the Earth. And way up in the ionosphere is where it's all positively charged. And the differential between the two is why we have lightning strikes. And so Winifred Schumann, he posited that these lightning strikes, which are constantly happening all over the planet, is what's causing this 7.8 hertz hum to the planet. And interestingly enough, this particular frequency is roughly correlative to our brains when they are operating in a nice, calm, relaxed alpha brainwave pattern. So it's almost as if our bodies itself are entrained to this frequency of the Earth. So now we have this full picture. We have our bodies as electromagnetic, entities, and we have the planet itself having its own electromagnetic pulse to it.
So that's what they call native EMF, right? That's what the world is made up of, and that's how we are wired, so to speak. We all have this electromagnetic frequency about us. But then there's something called non-native, which operates on a different frequency level. Is that right?
Absolutely. So let's take a little dive back into, Hilda, let's go back to your high school physics class. And maybe you remembered learning about something called the electromagnetic spectrum. Okay. And so this is in physics how we categorize all different types of radiation phenomena. So in the middle of that spectrum is visible light, white light coming from the sun, which splits off into all the colors of the rainbow. And then on one side towards red is where we have infrared. And infrared is really useful, right? We can have infrared saunas. Yep. And then on the other side of visible light, you have ultraviolet. And that too has its uses. Now, if you just take that as the middle of the electromagnetic spectrum, then it roughly divides in half the kind of radiation phenomena that we experience here on planet Earth. So on the one side, just beyond ultraviolet, is what is called ionizing radiation. And that's just a fancy way of saying these are forms of radiation that for sure, if you are exposed to them for any significant length of time, they will cause DNA damage. And then by extension, they will cause some form of mutation, which is cancer. So those are things like gamma radiation and X-ray radiation. Now, those two are very helpful forms of radiation. I mean, your doctor can give you an X-ray or order an X-ray and see where there's a broken bone, but you don't want to sit underneath an X-ray machine all day long. Obviously, that's going to cause harm to your body. Now, on the other end of the spectrum, just beyond red, infrared, is what's collectively known as radio frequency radiation or microwave radiation. And these are the things that are non-native in the sense that we created these forms of radiation. And that includes AM and FM broadcast towers. It includes cell phones and cell towers. It includes Wi-Fi, smart meters. All of these things are considered microwave or radio frequency forms of radiation.
Okay, so let me make sure I'm tracking properly. On the one side, it's ionizing radiation, and on the other, it's this radio frequency radiation.
Yes. Now, those types of radiation, if you look at it in terms of the electromagnetic spectrum, they're called non-ionizing forms of radiation because the belief has always been there is an insufficient amount of power, strength, within those frequencies to cause any cell damage. Now, that's a little deceiving, and we'll talk about why in a little bit in terms of the research. You know, I think the easiest thing to do to really ground it is to start talking about cell phones, because that's where the big interest lies. I mean, everyone pretty much has a cell phone these days. They have a smartphone, and it's attached to their person, or they're talking on it for multiple hours per day, right?
Mm-hmm.
So cell phones are an interesting thing in the sense that we have been assured by the telecommunications industry that they are safe. And the rationale that has been given for them being safe is basically laboratory analysis of what's called SAR, or specific absorption rate. So let me explain what SAR is and why it matters to you and me. So if you take a model of someone's head and you strap a phone to it, and then you turn it on and place a phone call, because it's a microwave radiation, there's going to be a certain amount of heating up that happens. Now, it's not like the microwave oven that you may or may not have at home. A microwave oven, you stick food in there, turn it on. It's a very strong microwave in the sense that it's a very high wattage. And that wattage is significant enough to take the water molecules in the food that you put in there and heat it up. Mm-hmm. And so the belief has been, well, a cell phone has that same frequency. We're all still talking about a microwave, right? A cell phone is nothing more than a small microwave that you're putting up to your head. But because the wattage is so much lower, it doesn't really appreciably heat up the tissue. So what SAR does, when the telecommunications industry assigns these SAR ratings to phones, they're looking at what's called the thermal effect, which is, does this small amount of microwave radiation at the small amount of wattage cause any heating up of the tissue? And that's what's regulated by the FCC as safe or not safe. Now, there are two major problems with assuming that this SAR rating is safe for us to use. Now, one of those is the modeling that they use in terms of, the dummy head with the cell phone strapped to it is of the adult male skull. So what do you think, Hilda, it would be the immediate problem that you would recognize by only modeling against the adult male skull?
Well, not everybody's skull is that size. And think about children who
right.
Not only are smaller, but their brains are at a different stage of development.
That's precisely right, yes. And their bone development is such that they have thinner skulls, and kids are using cell phones in increasing ways these days. So that already is a red flag that's not an appropriate test that's scalable to the entire user base for cell phones. Now, the second problem is that cell phones, in terms of SAR ratings, are only measuring the thermal effect. Does it heat up the tissue? However, what if there is a non-thermal effect that comes from microwave radiation?
So this is quite likely because, for example, there are waves, as you've discussed, that we cannot perceive with the naked eye. So we might not even feel a wave of something coming at us talking about physics, right?
Yeah.
But it's still doing something to us on the inside.
Absolutely. And so what evidence do we really have that there could be a non-thermal effect? Well, let me take you back in time again. We're going to go to 1995. So there was a researcher named Dr. Henry Lai, who was really the first person who looked at this in 95. And what he did is he took a rat brain cell, put it in a test tube, exposed it to microwave radiation, in this case from a cell phone, in a way to replicate what would be done, if a human being was using it. And he found that a SAR rating of 1.2 watts caused DNA strand breaks. Now, that's not a thermal effect. That's a non-thermal phenomena that's occurring. Now, his research was very interesting and compelling in many ways, but it didn't get really picked up in part because methodologically it's hard to translate, okay, it's for rat brain, does that really apply to humans? Kind of what's going on here. But then in 1998 is when Dr. George Carlo took up the banner. And I believe you had the honor of having him on your podcast, if I'm not mistaken.
That's right.
Yeah, so Dr. George Carlo is an amazing gentleman. And so he was brought on by the telecommunications industry. They brought him as part of the Wireless Technology Research Project to investigate this very claim. And so one of the teams that was working with him, of Drs. Tyson Hook, they did a little something different. They wanted to really refine this research of Dr. Henry Lai and take away all the factors that could be questioned. And so what they did is they actually used human blood cells. And they put those human blood cells in a test tube, and they had a new marker at this time, now back in 1998, to look for DNA damage. Mm-hmm. And that was something that's called micronuclei. And so what they were looking for when exposing these test tubes to microwave radiation is, can we measure the presence of micronuclei? I'll explain what that is. Think about your DNA being all intact within cells. And if that cell wall were to break and any of that DNA were to leak out, that would be suggestive of damage, obviously, to the cell and then by extension to the DNA. Right. If you see any of that floating around the test tube, that's micronuclei. And so what Dr. Carlo reported is that there was clear chromosome damage, as reported from the presence of micronuclei, from a SAR rating of only 1 watt per kilogram. Now, I'll put that in perspective. The FCC guideline for SAR right now is 1.6 watts per kilogram. So anything 1.6 watts or less is considered safe. But here we have now over 20 years ago that Dr. George Carlo reported that only 1 watt per kilogram was causing DNA damage.
Coming up, Brandon discusses the 3 main strategies to lower our EMF exposure and how nutrition plays a role in protecting us from its effects.
You're listening to the Wise Traditions podcast from the Weston A. Price Foundation. We pause now to recognize our sponsors.
Grass-fed kidney by Ancestral Supplements. Ancestral Supplements offer New Zealand-sourced nose-to-tail organ meats, bone marrow, and kidney in simple, convenient gelatin capsules. There's an old Comanche narrative that has been retold for generations about a young man who loved his wife so much that when she died, he fed her the fresh kidney of a buffalo, and then she came back to life. This tale has remained with the Comanche people to serve a greater purpose, to pass on the wisdom of feeding kidney to those who are ailing. There are many accounts of our ancestors taking an animal. The young and the warriors, for example, favored liver and heart, while the ailing, frail, and the old received kidney to build strength, immunity, and vitality. Kidney provided concentrated amounts of kidney-specific proteins, B12, selenium, and DAO, that are now absent from the modern diet. This nourishment is known to support kidney, urinary, thyroid, and histamine health. So visit ancestralsupplements.com to see what they can do for you. Ancestral Supplements, putting back in what the modern world has left out. Hey, and this month marks the 20th anniversary of the Weston A. Price Foundation. Help us celebrate 20 years of accurate information on diet and health by supporting local farms. Take the 50-50 pledge. Spend at least 50% of your food dollar on raw milk products, eggs, poultry, meat, and produce, for example, directly from local farmers and artisans. With the other 50% of your food dollar, you can celebrate how small the world has become and enjoy rice, pineapple, and spices from other parts of the world if you'd like. Go ahead and tag us at Weston A. Price on your social media posts related to this pledge, or use the hashtag 5050pledge. And thanks! Here's to another 20 years of living our best lives thanks to nutrient-dense food. This is Holistic Hilda, and you're listening to Wise Traditions. right. So my question is, how long did it take for that 1 watt to cause the DNA damage?
Oh, I'd have to look it up. I don't remember
Okay.
specifically. Yeah.
I was just curious because some people might say, well, I don't use my phone very much. This is not going to happen to me. And as a matter of fact, I know a lot of people who are very dismissive of the whole idea that EMFs cause any damage at all.
Okay, so let me address that question very specifically because I'm a student of history and I think we've seen this kind of thing before. So now we just took this this little view of, okay, cell phone star rating, DNA damage. But let's really truly ground that in history. Cigarette smoking. Okay? It wasn't all that long ago, Hilda. There was a time when you would see ads in a magazine for the brand of cigarettes that doctors would recommend. Okay? And even not all that long ago, when I was doing my postgraduate work in China, there were still doctors in China who were smoking in the hospitals. So, you look at something like cigarette smoking, it took us decades of research and really truly to be able to say that cigarette smoking causes lung cancer, to say nothing of secondhand smoke, okay? Now, that is completely self-evident to everyone. No one would disagree with that statement. And so here we are, and the reason why is because we have a very mature understanding of what cigarette smoking does. We understand through epidemiology, we understand through the mechanism of how it works. No one, again, would question that. We are on the other side of that curve in terms of research, in terms of understanding. What I would suggest to you is it's really the same story right now with electromagnetic fields. The only difference is we're on the very beginning of that, where we're starting to compile some research. But yet, everyone's using cell phones, there's Wi-Fi everywhere, and so we're all really lab rats in this grand experiment.
Wow. And now I want to talk to you about what we can do about it. I mean, I know, Brandon, there's a lot more to cover scientifically, and I will actually put a link in the show notes to your book so that people can do some research on their own. And also to the studies that you've mentioned, we'll put a link to those in the show notes as well. But I like to leave people with some hope, and
Absolutely.
I want to talk with you about some practical steps that we can take to lower our EMF exposure and hopefully, mitigate the damage.
Sure. So really, I've identified there's 3 main strategies that we can all employ to lower our risk from electropollution. And I will just say first, there's really, again, 3 things that we are concerned with. So we have microwave emitting devices, and those would be, again, cell phones, cell towers, things like cordless phones and smart meters, okay? And then we have electromagnetic fields from just the wiring of our homes and our offices. And that 50, 60 hertz wave can also give rise to another harmful form of electromagnetic fields, and those are called transient voltage, or another name for it is dirty electricity. And the third is the actual wiring of our house itself. So let's just say, you have a light or a lamp, and how close you sit to that lamp where your head is. You can measure very precisely if that's going to be a problem or not. So those are the 3 things we're looking at. We're looking at basically AC, which is alternating current electromagnetic fields. We're looking at these dirty electricity fields that occur on top of that. And then we're looking at these microwave radiation fields. Those are the 3 that we're concerned about. And each of them have a little different strategy.
Okay.
But the 3 that we're going to talk about are avoidance, how to position yourself so you're not exposed to them so much. Remediation, which is specific more for transient voltage, and then shielding. How can we put something in between us and the source of that electromagnetic field that we're protected? So let's start with avoidance. And again, we'll talk about the main interest, which is cell phones. Personally, I do not walk around with my cell phone on and operational. Either I have it in airplane mode, and then when I get to wherever I'm going, then if I wanted to check messages, I can take it off and check. And I don't hold a cell phone to my head if I need to use it. So I will either use a wired headset or I will put it on speakerphone. Bluetooth, I don't think is a great option. It is better in the sense that it is a lower wattage, but it's still the same frequencies that are going to be going into your ear, into your head. So I would really recommend only speakerphone or being wired if you're going to use a cell phone.
That's great advice. So I guess you wouldn't approve of the AirPods that people are using.
Yeah, in the same vein, it's kind of like Bluetooth in the same sense that that frequency is still being emitted to the head, again at a lower wattage, but it's still, now how significant of a problem that is, I don't know. We simply don't know. We don't have, again, decades worth of research to really tell us conclusively that is safe or not.
Right. But it might be wise to go a different route. Now, talk to us about our home. What should we do about our home?
So in terms of home, obviously a lot of people use a Wi-Fi router that they can transmit, and then all their different devices can pick it up. And I think the best possible solution is just to wire your house. Have someone come in who is skilled in, doing networking, and put Ethernet cables everywhere. We just did this with our house recently. I've got Ethernet cables running everywhere, and there's jacks, so you can, wherever you go, you can plug in, and you can even use that with mobile devices. I mean, you can have a tablet. There are ways to plug in a tablet through an Ethernet cable that you can look up online. So that's the best. Now, if you choose to use Wi-Fi, you really only have two options. You can just kind of turn it on as needed and then turn it off. Or if you're, again, going to choose to have it on all day long, and the very least, just shut it off when you go to sleep at night. And you can do that very easily. You can just go to the hardware store and buy a timer and just have it set to turn off right around bedtime, turn back on again in the morning.
Yeah, that's what we do.
Yeah. And obviously there's things you can avoid. If you live next to a cell phone tower, that's going to be pretty tricky. I mean, from my research, you want to be anywhere from half a mile or more away from a cell phone tower. And that's getting even more difficult now with the rollout of 5G.
Yes, I know there's a website, I think it's called searchantenna.com, where you
Right.
can see how close and how many towers are in your area.
Yep, absolutely. And you can use that to your advantage to see how far you can move away. And obviously, if you've got one close by, it's going to be tricky. Now, there are ways, and now we're going to get into the shielding aspect of the science of electromagnetic fields, is there is a way that you can use certain kinds of paint and certain kind of window treatments that would block the incoming cell phone tower radiation. So it is possible. Obviously, it would come at great expense, and you'd want to hire someone who is a professional EMF mitigator to help you with that project, but it is possible. The other way that shielding comes into play is, putting something between you and your device. So there's a lot of device products out there, for instance, that you can put on your cell phone to help shield from radiation. And there's the couple that I personally tested, one is Defender Shield and one is Safe Sleeve. And I would say, from me using my meters to measure, they do an admirable job of reducing the EMF from AC electric and AC magnetic. Do they do a really good job of reducing what we're most interested in, the microwave radiation? I'd say they blunt it, but I don't know if they reduce it to well over 90% like they claim. And I won't tell you which, but I contacted one of those two companies and reported my findings, and even asked them if they'd like to see a video of me using my meter to show how well it was working. And their only response is that their claim of 90% plus reduction in radiation only comes from their laboratory tests, and that I don't have laboratory equipment. Of course, that's nonsense, because my retort to that would be, well, no one talks on their phone in a laboratory. So I think they do offer a modicum of benefit, and I think they're probably still very valuable, but I don't want people to be lulled into complacency and still keep using their cell phone. I think that's still a bit too risky, and they should still be using a headset if they're talking on their phone.
Yeah, I do understand that there are paints we can use on our home. There are devices you can plug in near the router, different steps we can take to try to shield ourselves. And what do you think about what Dr. George Carlo told me when I had him on the show, that we should somehow adapt and become more resilient in the face of this? And how would we go about that, by the way?
So that's a great way to put it. And I do have a chapter just on resilience in my book for that reason. And anytime you say the word resilience, right, you have to go back to basics. It's about eating healthy, a Weston A. Price type diet. It's about getting enough sleep and exercise. And then if you feel like you either through work or home, you are constantly being exposed to these. Let's say you're an airplane pilot and you're going in and out of airports and up in the sky where you're exposed to a lot of radiation. Well, then we can talk about, okay, what strategies can we employ that can safeguard you for the amount of radiation you're being exposed to? And here I have a couple of suggestions. One is magnesium. We didn't have time to go into all the different evidence about, the mechanism of how EMFs affect us. But one of the ones that is pretty well understood at this point is that electromagnetic fields increase tissue calcium. They have a way of deranging calcium in its movement within the cells. And so magnesium is the natural antidote for that. It will help kind of re-establish balance between calcium and magnesium in the cells. And so most people, frankly, I can say this as a clinician, tend to be deficient in magnesium. And so it's not all that uncommon for me to say, try 200 to 400 milligrams of magnesium and see how you do. It's a very safe water-soluble mineral. If you get too much of it, you'll just be running to the bathroom to flush it out. And if you are taking, let's say, 300 milligrams of magnesium and you're not having any bowel issues, guess what? Your body's absorbing, utilizing all of that, and it is giving you some protection, at least in theory, in terms of the mechanism of how EMF is likely affecting us.
And I think in your book, you also mentioned the value of melatonin. Some people think of melatonin simply in association with how well they sleep and as a sleep hormone, but you said it kind of has an antioxidant effect, which is helpful.
Absolutely. So that brings to light another mechanism of how electromagnetic fields can be affecting us, is that they suppress melatonin. And melatonin itself is a free radical scavenger, so it acts as an extremely potent antioxidant. This is one of the early theories about how EMF can be causing cancer, and it wasn't just because EMF directly caused cell damage, although we now know it does, but because maybe it's inhibiting our body's ability to counter cancer cells that are kind of rogue cells that are being developed in our body. And so melatonin does that. And so taking a low dose of melatonin, we're saying anywhere from 1 to 3 milligrams a day, could be helpful to someone who is in a high-risk environment day in and day out.
And I understand our melatonin production is less hindered when we wear, for example, blue blockers at night, when we limit the amount of blue light that's getting to our pineal gland that's hindering our melatonin production.
Sure. So electromagnetic fields clearly do that. And bright light at night will clearly do that. So, there's a lot of different ways that our melatonin can become affected. And lighting is a pretty important thing too. We didn't get a whole lot of time to talk about that, but the kind of light bulbs that we buy and the lighting that we use definitely has a massive impact on electromagnetic fields. The safest ones still, although they're not very energy efficient, are just old-fashioned incandescents. You could measure very small fields coming off of those bulbs. And on the other end of the spectrum, the ones that are probably the worst are fluorescents and compact fluorescents. They have the old-fashioned tube lighting. I had them in my clinic here for years. You can hear the buzz coming off of them from that ballast. Anytime current is restricted, or anytime it's modulated between AC and DC, that has the potential to cause these quite significant electromagnetic fields. And so getting rid of fluorescent bulbs, compact fluorescent, they've got mercury in them anyway. There's no reason they should be in your house. If you need lighting that is more efficient, LEDs are better. I wouldn't say they're perfect, and they've got other issues with them, but they're, from an electromagnetic field perspective, they're definitely better than fluorescents.
Well, I think we're going to have you on the show again, because there's so much to get into that we didn't have a chance to cover today.
Absolutely. We can do a part 2.
Okay, great. And then the other question I have for you is, just as we wrap up, if the listener could do one thing or take one step, I guess I would say, to lower their exposure to non-native electromagnetic fields, what would you recommend that they do?
If you've got a Wi-Fi router in your house, and you're going to be exposed to it all the time, I would say either turn it on when you need it, or in the very least, shut it off at night so you're not getting exposed to it during our most vulnerable time when we're sleeping, when we should be repairing.
Oh, absolutely. Well, thank you so much for this conversation, Brandon. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, you're welcome, Hilda. It's always good to talk to you.
Our guest today was Brandon LaGreca. Find out more about his work at easttroyacupuncture.com. And you can find me on my new Holistic Hilda YouTube channel. And the show notes for this and every episode of the Wise Tradition podcast are found on our westinaprice.org website. So that's it. Thanks for listening, everybody, and see you next time.
Wise Traditions is a project of the Weston A. Price Foundation for wise traditions in food, farming, and the healing arts. The content on this podcast is provided for informational purposes only and is not intended to substitute for the advice provided by your doctor or other healthcare professional. It is not intended to be, nor does it constitute healthcare or medical advice.